With the 4 officers involved in George Floyd's death facing criminal charges, many eyes have turned to the man who's prosecuting them. That's Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison. HuffPost political reporter Daniel Marans recently interviewed the Attorney General and more than 20 people who got to know him and a sense of what got Ellison to this moment. When asked about prosecuting the case, Ellison said, "They have every right to be anxious about it, but what can we do other than march forward and do our best?" Daniel joins us now via Skype for a little bit more. Dan, it's great to see you.
Great to be here.
All right, so Dan, tell us a little bit about this. We've kind of been fascinated by Keith Ellison. He's really found himself at the center of this movement. I think his most consequential action to date has been bumping up the charge against Officer Chauvin in the case against George Floyd to second-degree murder. Did you guys get into that? And broadly, how do you think that Ellison is meeting this moment?
Well, he really sort of steers clear of the specifics of the case, and he said that in public statements as well. He'll reiterate kind of the definition of second-degree murder as a felony, which, without intent. So it's also second-degree murder. It's not the highest form of second-degree murder, but he really prefers not to reveal anything about his arguments. But I think what's interesting is that he didn't announce the charges right away, and he didn't once he took up the post. It took about 3 days, which he really defends on the grounds of due process, rigor, being able to assess the charges. And that's something that some people thought sort of from his left, thought he should have done more rapidly, that when there's a suspect in an ordinary case, the state doesn't show that kind of trepidation. But, overall, we're really looking at a guy who, starting off in law school in the late 80s, was a leading activist against police brutality, police violence, and excesses in the city of Minneapolis. He was a guy leading those same marches, and he sort of evolved over time to really test the boundaries of the inside game. And through a series of coincidences ends up here, one of which is losing the race to become chairman of the Democratic National Committee. So he finds himself in a situation where he is now the sort of the face of the government to activists. He's sort of there, and he certainly, it's very apparent to me that the government sees him as a kind of shield in a way, as a sort of healer, and he needs to sort of carefully walk that line of pursuing justice regardless of where it comes down, and trying to bring a city and state to heal, and also pull through on long-held principles that he's held since he was on the other side of the divide.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's the most interesting thing I see with Ellison, is that he finds himself one of the top law enforcement officers in the state of Minnesota, but also has frankly been pretty anti-law enforcement from the point of view of somebody like me. How is he going to square that divide? Because at the same time, you have all this, we have the dismantling the police in the city of Minneapolis, or at least that vote by the city council there. How is Ellison kind of squaring some pretty fraught political stuff for him at this moment?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Well, I think the answer is that he's just not adopting the furthest left talking points. Mm-hmm. He does not support even the quote unquote slogan of defund the police. Even I didn't necessarily get a chance to break it down for him what the different possible interpretations of it was, but he sort of immediately responded, "No, I don't support defund the police. I think we need to reform the police. I believe that there are a lot of officers that are on my side." I think he sees himself as needing to be in a position where he can be seen as something of an honest broker to bring about some of the changes. One of the things he is calling for is for playing hardball with the police union, so that there are tougher negotiations over things like arbitration in the event of abuse complaints, more accountability for use of force. And he even floated the possibility of legally curtailing collective bargaining rights to be limited to benefits, pay, and pensions. But, he got into it with me about as sort of some of the nuances of this. He acknowledged that there are poor communities of color, where the police are often just as desperately needed in many situations, that there are high crime rates. Of course, some of those same communities don't trust the police to be responsive when they need them. So that's a complicated dynamic. And I think as I said, he's navigated that in part by taking a different line. And I think, in some ways it's an authentic line for him. He has deviated from sort of left orthodoxy, believe it or not, in the recent past as well, on things like deplatforming of right-wing speakers. He opposes that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting just kind of microcosm of what it looks like when somebody like this, who's a leftist, ascends to law enforcement, and kind of what the different political pressures are like that. What do you think? How do you interpret it in terms of how he handles this case and going forward, and what will mean future for any sort of leftist movement? I'm curious what you think.
I think, he's doing his best to tamp down expectations. The state of Minnesota has only prosecuted a single cop for murder, and he happened to be a black cop, Muhammad Noor, who killed a very white, very wealthy, well-connected woman. And so Ellison still has to deal with the reality of a jury of Derek Chauvin's peers and those other cops' peers. People go back and forth with me in terms of the legal intricacies here. Minnesota actually does have more capacious murder statutes. It's easier, for example, to prosecute someone on second-degree murder. I don't want to go into all the technicalities there, but that may work to his advantage, especially because there is this report that literally attributes the cause of death to the officer. But they're going to make arguments about the health of the man, George Floyd, going into the interaction. And so I think it's a really tough place for Ellison, because he can handle this perfectly and still suffer the blowback, the public blowback, including from some people that would traditionally be seen as his base, if he doesn't get those convictions. And then I think we're liable to look at more unrest and dislocation in the city of Minneapolis, where Ellison has lived since, in the predominantly black North Side since he was in law school. So it's a very difficult situation. It's high risk, high reward. And we're seeing ways in which Ellison can manage it in terms of rhetoric and framing. But as I said, a lot of it, I think, will just come down to the jury.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Well, thanks so much for breaking this all down, Dan. We really appreciate it, man.
You're very welcome.
Next on Rising, as of May, 31% of voters identify as Democrat, 28% as Republicans, according to Gallup. But what if our concept of political identity is completely wrong? Friend of the show, Zed Jelani, he elaborates when Rising continues.